In this section, we discuss global illumination or GI or indirect lighting. We'll learn about the basic concepts, we'll learn about different GI engines and which one to use in different lighting situations. In this video, I'll be explaining some of the fundamental concepts regarding global illumination or indirect lighting. Global illumination is a series of algorithms to make lighting in 3D renders more realistic and look closer to how light rays work in real world. Without global illumination enabled in the settings, we would only get direct lighting, the light that directly comes from a light source. But when GI is enabled, those light rays won't be killed off when they hit the first surface point on their way from the light source. Like real world, those light rays start to bounce back and forth from those surfaces, and as those light rays hit a surface, they arrive with illumination and color information from the last surface point that they hit. But with each bounce, they lose some of that energy until we instruct the light rays to stop bouncing. Keep what I just explained in mind. Let's go to the scene and let's see what we have. As you can see, it's a fairly simple scene and it's going to help us to go through the very basics of global illumination concepts very easily. Now, you notice I have a redshift area light on the ceiling and that is our only light source in the scene. I have two cameras in the scene and for the second one, I have near clipping enabled so we can see inside the room. If I open up Redshift's render view, I have already saved some renders from this scene. In the first two renders, global illumination or GI is disabled, so we are only dealing with direct lighting. And in the last two renders, GI is enabled, so we have both direct and indirect lighting. I'm gonna just open up the render with GI off from our first camera. Now let's see how light rays function in real world. So first, the light rays are cast from the light source into the scene. Those light rays travel until they hit a surface, and based on how bright the light source is and how far is the surface from the light source, the surface gets illuminated. When a specific light ray hits a surface, obviously it can't continue its path and we get shadows. Right now, the shadows are very dark. That is because GI or indirect lighting is turned off and we won't allow our light rays to bounce back and forth between surfaces and they get killed off as soon as they hit the first surface on their way from the light. But as I mentioned earlier, light rays aren't killed off when they first hit a surface. They are going to bounce back and forth between surfaces and transform illumination and color information between them. When we enable GI, we allow the light rays to have this realistic behavior. Now, if I open up the render with GI on from the first camera, now we can see the shadows are a lot brighter. So let's draw some light rays here and see how this realistic behavior is happening. We focus on this desk and chair here, and you can imagine the same behavior for the rest of the scene. So the light rays are cast from the light source in different directions. Obviously, some rays hit the top of the desk and top of the chair, illuminate those surfaces, and cast shadows beneath them. Now let's imagine a light ray hits the floor near the chair and the desk. Now, as we know, this ray is going to continue to bounce, and let's say in its first bounce, it hits under the chair and illuminate that surface a bit. It bounces from that surface again, and based on its vector and trajectory, it's probably going to hit the areas with the dark shadows beneath the chair and therefore making the shadows a bit brighter. Obviously, with each bounce, the ray loses some of its energy. One of the other fascinating things about GI is what we call color bleeding. As I mentioned, those light rays carrying both illumination information and color information. Now let's clear out these drawings and let's say a light ray is cast from the light source and hits this red wall. We have GI on, so we expect the light to bounce and hit another surface. Now, based on the surface properties, this light ray might scatter into several rays and each one would continue to bounce in the scene. Let's say one of these rays bounces back and hit the ceiling near the wall. This ray now has some color information and has picked some red color from the wall. And when it hits the next surface, that surface is going to be a bit redder compared to before arriving this ray. If I hover over and take a look at the pixel information on the right side, we can clearly see the red value here is way more compared to the green and blue values. You might ask, if this ray is having red information, why it's not turning the surface into a pure or a bit more obvious red color? Because first of all, this light ray is losing energy at each bounce, and also the receiving surface has some surface properties. In this case, it's a white diffuse surface that might block some of that information. Here in this render, we can see all the surfaces close to the red wall or facing it are redder and the ones close to the green wall or facing it are greener. In this example, we use some lonely rays to explain how light functions, but in fact for each scene we are dealing with millions of rays, and that's why the renders are often take some time. Now let's open up the render settings window in Redshift to enable global illumination. While in the basic mode, you can check this global illumination checkbox, but in the advanced mode, we have the global illumination tab and you can check enable GI using this enable checkbox to get Redshift to calculate GI or indirect lighting for you. The first thing you'll notice is we have primary and secondary engines. Primary engine is calculating the first light bounce and secondary engine calculates subsequent bounces. And obviously you can use different methods like brute force, point cloud, and light cache to compute those light bounces. Now let's see how Redshift uses these primary and secondary engines. Let's go to our second camera with GI on render. Our main camera is about here in the scene. Now, in order to determine what's in the view, Redshift casts the first rays from the camera into the scene. When a ray hits a surface, to determine whether that point is in illumination or in shadow, a ray which is called a shadow ray, let's use a black color for this ray, will be cast towards the light source. If there is no object between that point and the light source, that point would be in direct illumination. But if there is an obstacle between that point and the light source, that point will be in shadow. Until now, we just determined the direct illumination, whether a point is in direct light or in shadow. Now it's time to calculate GI or indirect illumination. So let me just clear these drawings. The colors I'm using here are for pure presentation and have absolutely no specific meaning or role in the calculations. Now, these green rays are cast from the camera. And when they hit a point on a surface, a sample will be created. That is what we call a GI sample. And let's imagine these samples are red. Now from this point or sample, which we already have its direct lighting information, whether it's in direct light or shadow, the first primary GI engine comes to play and sends out a hemispherical burst of rays into the scene to gather information from the scene. So if a ray hits the green wall based on the distance between the sample and the wall, that point will get some of that green color from the wall. And if another ray, let's say, hits the red color on the other wall, and let's say that red wall is closer to the sample point compared to the green wall, now that sample point will gather more red compared to green. So that's what the primary engine does. But we said that in real world, the rays are not going to be stopped when they first hit a surface. From the second bounce, the secondary GI engine comes to play, and from each primary ray casts or bounces another ray, and that ray, which let's say is blue, will continue to bounce in the scene and transform information between points in the scene. The secondary engine will continue to bounce the rays in the scene and will stop based on the settings in the global illumination tab. So we can tell the secondary GI engines to bounce each ray for, let's say, 4 times or 3 times in the scene. Obviously, the more we let the rays to bounce, the scene gets brighter and the final render would be more realistic. But as with each bounce, the rays lose some energy. After a while, they don't have any worthy contribution to the final lighting. So we can kill them off, and by doing so, our render times will be more manageable. Also, we can control the first burst of rays, which is controlled by the primary engine. We can determine how many rays it will cast into the scene from each sample. We can do that in the settings window, and more rays will result in a cleaner GI solution. We will discuss all of that and specific settings for different GI engines in the rest of this section. So that was an introduction to how light functions and what is direct and indirect lighting, what is GI, and how it works in Redshift. See you in the next lesson to learn more about different GI engines and other topics related to indirect lighting.